lecture on global issues. I'm Dr. Caitlin Fora, Director of the Global Studies Institute, and I'm honored to welcome you to this special event. This annual lecture series, generously sponsored by the Curris family, is part of the Global Studies Institute's mission to foster critical reflection on global challenges and build bridges between the university and the wider world. It's also a space for our students, faculty, and community to engage with leading voices in diplomacy, development, and international affairs. I would like to extend a heartfelt welcome to the Curris family, Dino, Joe, Bob, and Bobby. We're deeply grateful for your vision and generosity in making this annual lecture possible, and we're honored to carry forward Elena's memory and values through this lecture series. I'm going to begin tonight with our land acknowledgement. CSULB is located on the sacred site of Pavunga. We acknowledge that we are on the land of the Tongva, Gabrieleño, and the Ahachiman-Guaneño nations who have lived and continue to live here. We recognize the Tongva and Ahachiman nations and their spiritual connection as the first stewards and the traditional caretakers of this land. And we thank them for their strength, perseverance, and resistance. I also want to thank the many people behind the scenes who helped make this evening possible, the Alumni Center staff and the catering team for keeping us well fed, for hosting us, our wonderful departmental administrative support assistant, Naomi Rangel. She of course disappeared and was doing something. Without her, none of this would have worked. Dr. Lily House-Peters, the assistant director of the Global Studies Institute, and our Global Studies Chair, Laura Chea. The College of Liberal Arts Dean's Office, especially Marissa Garcia, Jonathan Miklas, and Lynn Bowman for their support. Spencer Ott, who has lent his photography skills to us this evening. Our interim dean, Dan O'Connor. Our associate deans, Donna Nickel and Chia Chung. And University Leadership Provost Karen Sissom-Gum, and Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, Pei Fang Pang. And we thank all of them for their support this evening. I'd also like to recognize and welcome our colleagues from Leadership Long Beach, a community close to Elena's heart. And also offer a warm welcome to all the community members, alumni, and friends of the university joining us tonight. Tonight we're privileged to welcome a remarkable speaker, Ambassador William Taylor Jr., whose distinguished career as a diplomat reflects a deep commitment to international cooperation and effective diplomacy. One of the things that I heard this afternoon as Ambassador Taylor met with one of our undergraduate classes, when he spoke about his professional trajectory, is that meaningful paths are often shaped not by a fixed plan, but by a willingness to recognize and step into unexpected opportunities. So thank you all for taking the opportunity to be here with us tonight and be part of this conversation. And now please join me in welcoming Provost Karen Sissom-Gum, who will introduce the Curris family.
Thank you, Dr. Fora, and good evening to everyone. It's my pleasure to join Dr. Fora in welcoming all of you to the annual Elena Diane Curris Lecture on Global Issues. As noted, I'm Karen Sissom-Gum, and I very proudly serve as Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs here at the beach. As we gather this evening, I'm honored to welcome the Curris family, welcoming all of you, including Elena's father, Constantine, mother, Jo, brother, Bob, and sister-in-law, Bobby, as well as our special guests, Dr. Michael and Ellen Karff, and our distinguished guest speaker, the Honorable William B. Taylor. Where are you, sir? On behalf of Cal State Long Beach, I want to thank former Ambassador Taylor for his extraordinary service and for sharing his experiences and insights and perspectives with us this evening. The Curris family's continued generosity has made this lecture series possible, enriching both our campus and our broader community. And for that, we extend our sincere gratitude to you for your support and for honoring Elena Diane Curris's legacy in such a meaningful and enduring way. Elena's global curiosity and commitment to international education are at the heart of this event. Through this endowment, her legacy lives on, encouraging us to engage deeply with the complex global issues that shape our shared future. As you may know, Cal State Long Beach is in a moment of leadership transition following longtime President Jane Close Connolly's retirement. We are eagerly awaiting our incoming president, Dr. Lauren J. Blanchard. He arrives on May 1st. Throughout this transition, speaking of transition, we remain committed to honoring Elena's legacy, which parallels our mission and values, and those are all unwavering. As an institution of higher education, it is of grave importance that our faculty, staff, and our students are our why. They are why we come every day. They are why we advance this mission. It's important that we all remain informed and wrestle with and discuss and contemplate ongoing global issues that greatly touch and impact our lives. I'm proud to work at a campus such as this, here at the beach, because we are committed to ensuring all, and those of you who know me, know when we say all, we mean capital A, capital L, capital L. All are welcome, and that we can exchange our unique and diverse perspectives with compassion, with empathy, understanding, and conviction. This is critical in understanding our unique roles when advocating for human rights, and in assuring that we never lose sight of our common humanity. I'm grateful to each of you for taking the opportunity to attend tonight's lecture, and for being informed global citizens who strive to see the very humanity in all. Let's continue shaping the global future together. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to welcome Bobby Curris to share a few words.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Yes, my name is Bobby Curris, Elena, my sister-in-law. It has been my honor to give remarks at this event on behalf of the family for a few years, and I always feel like it is my job to do three things: show some gratitude, talk about Elena, and finally, give you all an assignment. We are on a college campus after all. Yes. So first up, gratitude. The event gets bigger and better every year, as evidenced by all of you being here. A special thank you to Caitlin and Marissa for managing the 1 million details that went into the planning of tonight's event. But know, if you had a hand in this event, to include those simply attending, we see you and we thank you. This year, I also have the pleasure of introducing two very special guests, Dr. Michael and Ellen Park, both near and dear to Elena and the Curris family. Dr. Park was head of hospitals at UCLA before becoming Executive Vice President of Health Affairs at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Park has been recognized nationally for his visionary delivery of healthcare, and together he and Ellen have introduced expansive music and art programs within hospitals as part of the healing process. A special note, Ellen's dogs, Bonnie and Clyde, who famously provided love and care to the very youngest of patients. Let us welcome them today as they both celebrate their birthdays today. As mentioned, I want to paint a picture of Elena as memory for those that did know her and introduction for those that did not. At past events, I have shared my musings on what Elena would have thought about past presentations, my thoughts on what she would have thought about the events of the past 10 years, my thoughts. It occurred to me, you might be tired of my thoughts. So after all, I'm not the only one that has memories of Elena. So I phoned a friend, several friends, colleagues, family members of Elena. I asked for input, and the response predictably overwhelming. I simply do not have time to share everything, but I'm going to do my best to capture the sentiments shared in a few stories. We shall begin at the beginning. Philip Bryan, born the day after Bob, Elena's brother. Bob and Philip met on their 5th birthday, and Elena came along about 3 years later. Philip had older sisters, but Elena was the younger sister he never had. You have to understand, Dino and Joe, Elena's parents, were President and First Lady of Murray State University in Murray, Kentucky. Philip's dad, also worked at Murray, so the boys and Elena grew up on a college campus. Philip said, "We never minded Elena playing with us because she was just plain cool from the start. She on her small big wheel, and the two of us on bikes would fly out of the garage at Oakhurst, the president's home, and onto the driveway and the private sidewalks at the front lawn with the importance of Bob's mission of the day at hand. Ramps were built and jumps completed. Elena was fearless from the start." Growing up, Elena would spend time with her Uncle Bruce and Aunt Kay and their 4 girls, Elena's cousins. Shanna holds a particular memory of staying at a hotel with their grandparents when they were about 9 or 10, and Elena thinking it would be great fun to take the mattresses off the beds and hide them in the bathroom. Grandpa Bob was not thrilled with that. All the girls remembered fun times at the beach when the entire family would vacation together. One time in particular when Aunt Alice woke up to her bikini on ice. Cousin Cindy remembered going to space camp with Elena. She distinctly remembers that Elena was social, making fast friends, and proving herself a natural leader, approaching every task with determination and eagerness, pulling teammates together for their mock space missions. Aunt Kay remembered taking the ski boat out, and Elena, having never skied before, hopped right out of the water. A natural at skiing, Kay said. I will add, Elena was also natural at snow skiing. Aunt Alice of the frozen bikini remembers one Christmas when she and Elena's grandparents went to the Curris Lake House in Kentucky for the holidays. Upon walking into the room and seeing the Christmas tree, I was shocked to see how puny it was, Alice said. So I asked Dino why such a tree was selected, and Dino said Elena picked it because she knew no one else would. To this day, Alice says that is her favorite Christmas tree. Thea Nicky described Elena as a free-spirited, tenacious child possessing at an early age confidence, curiosity, vision, and of course intelligence. Elena, as some of you may remember from my previous remarks, was a graduate of the University of Alabama. One of her dear friends and college roommates, Tracy Porch, had this to say: "Losing a friend like Elena leaves a kind of silence. It's not just the absence of voice and laughter, it's the inside jokes that don't land the same way, the message you almost send before remembering, the moments where you instinctively turn to share something and can't. I choose to honor her memory in a couple of ways. Elena and I went on lots of trips together," she said, "so at some point on every trip, I drink a toast to her memory. And I remind myself to say yes when I might have said no. I believe the courage to do so is a piece of her still moving through the world. Her brightness did not disappear. It left an imprint on everyone that knew her." Elena loved her time at CSULB, and the people here loved her. This from coworkers at the University Relations and Development Department. "She always seemed fearless to me, and I really admired that. She really saw people. You didn't have to have a certain kind of job or look or sound or act a certain way. She'd always find a way to connect. She had a lot of empathy and, of course, the best sense of humor." Another coworker shared, "Elena gave me a card that I still keep on a little display near my bed. The front has a quote from Anais Nin: 'Life shrinks or expands in proportion to one's courage.'" I'm going to say that again because it struck me. "Life shrinks or expands in proportion to one's courage." Elena wrote the most encouraging message inside the card. In part, she wrote, You need to aid the healing process with positivity and strength. Face the fear. I know you can do it. The coworker went on to say, I don't remember what issue I was having that prompted the card, but I will keep it forever. Elena was a graduate of Leadership Long Beach. Matt, the director, is here this evening, as well as several other board members, some of Elena's class, other classes, and several recipients of the Elena Curris Leadership Long Beach Scholarship. A very special welcome to you all. Sabrina Sanders of Elena's class could not be here tonight, but she shared this with me. And after having lunch with Matt and Tracy yesterday, Sabrina's story takes on a little more meaning. One of the first things our cohort did, Sabrina said, was to attend a leadership seminar, going to the mountain, I believe it's called. Is that correct, my Leadership Long Beach folks? She said we were all together trying to figure out each other on the first day, and it was Elena who immediately started drawing people together, drawing them in, and making them feel comfortable. The whole group started to relax. Probably extra helpful on Wall Day. Sound familiar? The last recollection I'll share comes from Elena's dear friend and Seal Beach neighbor, Joe. One of my favorite memories, she said, is when we went to buy Christmas trees together. I drove because somehow Elena always convinced me to. We saw every tree on the lot, and finally, Linda landed on, wait for it, a sad, puny little Christmas tree. Joe, however, said this was my first real Christmas tree, so I bought a beast, not thinking how we would get it home. The big tree was tied to the top of my little car, and off we went, both very happy with our purchases, almost home, and planning our tree decorating. I forgot the beast was on top of the car. Took a corner a bit fast, and the next moment, Elena screamed as the tree was sideways on the car. Not being able to pull over, we opened the sunroof, and Elena grabbed the beast and held on to it like a champ. I couldn't stop laughing as Elena's head disappeared into the tree branches. She was so tightly holding on to it. The beast made it home, and I spent hours decorating my tree, while Elena's tree was festooned with one bauble, and it was glorious, Joe said. There are people in this audience who did know Elena and have their own thoughts and memories. Hold them dear. But I'm going to leave my comments here, first with a general reminder. As you move through life and attend events like this, in honor, memory of people, anything with someone's name, never forget that name was a real person, a real family that misses them greatly. Now for your assignment. I didn't forget. In the coming weeks, you are tasked with channeling Elena. Be fearless, be bold, but always temper with kindness and humor. Take risks. Say yes when your first thought is to say no. Laugh often and loudly. Be a little mischievous on occasion. When you know someone is hurting, take that extra step. Maybe send them a card. They might just keep it forever. And when the holidays roll around and you see that sad little Christmas tree on the lot, you'll know what to do. As always and forever, go Beach, roll Tide.
Good evening, I'm Dan O'Connor, Interim Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. On behalf of the College of Liberal Arts and the Global Studies Institute, I want to welcome you to this great annual event. The College of Liberal Arts is the intellectual hub of the university. That's right. Thank you to all of our organizers, especially GSI Director Dr. Caitlin Forat, Assistant Director Dr. Lily House-Peters, our CLA Director of Development, Marissa Garcia, and her team, and most of all, the generous donation of the Curris family that makes this event possible. As has been mentioned, the Curris Lecture offers us an opportunity to listen to and engage with an expert on global issues. Unfortunately, there's not much to talk about these days. So I begin with a question for you. It's kind of a thought experiment. Do you remember where you were or what you were doing on New Year's Day 2026? Think about it. It was a Thursday, just a hint. Perhaps some of you woke up early to attend or watch the Rose Parade. Perhaps some of you spent the day watching college football bowl games. Perhaps you were busy recovering from New Year's Eve events. And by that I mean staying up late to watch the ball drop in New York City. January 1st, 2026 was exactly 15 weeks ago from today. 15 weeks. What has happened in terms of global issues during the last 15 weeks? Let me share a brief list. And I share the following without judgment. Well, maybe a little bit of judgment. On January 3rd, U.S. troops entered Venezuela and forcibly abducted the President Nicolás Maduro and his wife and brought them to a prison in New York where they currently reside. With that action, Venezuela joined 6 other countries in which the U.S. had conducted military actions during the previous year, including Nigeria, Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. In the days following, President Trump and his spokespersons suggested that an invasion of Cuba might be next. January 20th marked the 1-year anniversary of the second Trump administration, a year that witnessed the president threaten to annex Canada, threaten to take and invade the Panama Canal, kind of personal to my heart, threatened to invade Greenland, threatened to take military action against Mexican cartels, and impose tariffs on most of the nations of the world. On February 28th, the U.S. and Israel launched military strikes against political and military targets in Iran, an intervention/war/excursion, call it what you will, that has now lasted 47 days and cost the American taxpayer between $60 and $90 billion. A war for which the consequences remain unmeasured fully, and with which we will be felt for decades. In other global news, the United States has destabilized NATO and turned away from our longtime allies, while cozying up to pretty much every dictator on the planet. We've also essentially abandoned support for Ukraine in its war with Russia. So you might ask, what is going on? How do we make sense of this? Well, you came to the right place. Our keynote speaker tonight will have much to say about many of these events and so much more. Ambassador William B. Taylor Jr. is a graduate of West Point and served as an infantry officer in combat during the Vietnam War. He is a graduate of the Harvard University School of Government. His early government career found him working for the Department of Energy. He served as a legislative assistant for New Jersey Senator Bill Bradley. His early diplomatic career found him engaging in reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2006, he was appointed by then President George W. Bush to serve as ambassador to Ukraine, where he served until 2009. He later oversaw diplomatic and reconstruction efforts in Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon, and Syria following the Arab Spring. He served as vice president of the U.S. Institute of Peace and is currently a distinguished fellow with the Atlantic Council. Ambassador Bill Taylor has lived a professional life devoted to peacemaking. He is the quintessential public servant, and I am honored to invite him to share his thoughts with us.
Thank you. That was too long and too generous. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to be a participant in the 9-year legacy of this gift that you give to the community. So thank you, Joe. And it's an honor to be able to participate. I am not going to speak about all of those things that Dan just described. I'm going to talk mainly about one, and with a little bit to start off with on Iran, because Iran's such in the news as at the top of what Dan just described. I'll talk a little bit about that, as it applies to Ukraine. Second part, I'll give you an update on Ukraine. What's going on there in terms of the war, in terms of the effort to end the war, what the morale is like. I've been there many times since the big war started. I will be glad to have that opportunity to talk to you about that. And then the last part of what I will speak about is how could this war end? How could this war end? And then the best part of the discussion will follow, which is your questions, your comments. I'd love to get your thoughts about any of the things that I've had to say, or if you've got some questions on what Dan said, you can do that. So let me start with Ukraine and Iran. On the 28th of February, as you said, we went into the United States and Israel, went into Iran. That had a big effect. I was actually on my way out of Ukraine at that time. I was on a train leaving Ukraine. We heard on our phones that there was something going on, and only when we got out of Ukraine did we find out what was going on. It had a big effect on Ukraine. Let me just say a couple of pieces of that. One is it took the attention of the world, really, but also of people who were trying to deal with the Ukraine war, the Russia's war on Ukraine, took the attention from all of that and focused it on Iran. Not only the attention, but also resources. The ability for the Ukrainians to defend themselves against the Russians depends a lot on what we can provide, on interceptors that can knock down missiles that the Russians send against us, against Ukraine. And all of those interceptors, all of those weapons that help them defend themselves went to Iran at that point. So it took away from the effort that we had, that the world had been providing, particularly the Europeans and some of the Americans, to help the Ukrainians defend themselves against the Russians. However, one of the things it also did was clarify. The Iran war clarified who's on what side. The Russians are providing military intelligence to the Iranians. The Russians are providing information on U.S. forces and Allied forces and U.S. allies. The Russians are providing that to the Iranians, and the Iranians are attacking them. Ukrainians, on the other hand, are using the knowledge that they've gained on learning how to defend against drones that the Russians have fired at them for 4 years. Ukrainians know that the Iranians first gave these drones to the Russians. The Russians have made some modifications and have then used them against the Ukrainians. Ukrainians have figured out how to defend themselves against these drones, and the Ukrainians are providing that information to the United States, to the Saudis, to the Qataris, to the Emiratis, even as they continue to defend themselves against the Russians. It clarified who is on what side. It clarified who's the friend and who's the enemy. That leads then to what's going on my second point, what's going on the ground in Ukraine. First of all, they've been fighting 1,511 days. You were talking about numbers of days. 1,511 days, the Ukrainians, not a big nation, not a powerhouse, have defended themselves against the Russian army. And they still stand. They still stand. They have stopped the Russians from doing what Vladimir Putin said he was going to do. Vladimir Putin has been very clear about what his intent is. Putin has said he wants to destroy Ukraine. He wants to wipe Ukraine off of it. He doesn't think that Ukraine is really a nation. He doesn't think the Ukrainians are really a people, are really a civilization that actually goes back farther than the Russians. This is what Putin has said he wants to do, Ukrainians know this. Ukrainians are defending themselves against a force that is trying to destroy them. This is existential for the Ukrainians. They have been fighting and defending themselves for some years, 1,511 days, and they have stopped the Russians for the last 3 years. The Russians first took a bunch of territory, the Ukrainians then pushed them back, and for the last 3 years, the Russians have been trying to take more territory and failing. The Ukrainians have stopped them from moving further into Ukraine. The Russians have thrown a lot of soldiers at this war, at these front lines. They've lost more than 1.2 million Russians have died or been wounded so bad they have to take off the battlefield. This has been, so that the effect of the Russian battle fighting against Ukraine has been dramatic, and the Ukrainians have stopped them. The morale of the Ukrainians is much higher than the Russians. The morale of the Ukrainians, as you would understand, they're defending themselves, they're defending their family, they're defending their land, they're defending their ability to live. They remember, the Ukrainians remember what it's like to live under the Russians, under the Soviets. They don't want to go back there. So their morale, their determination, their resilience to maintain this fight, to stay in this fight as long as it's going to take for them to prevail, is clear, is very clear. In the air, the Ukrainians are now sending as many drones deep into Russia as the Russians are attacking or sending into Ukraine. This is a change. The Russians have been bombarding for the past 4 years, Ukrainians, with missiles, with drones, with cruise missiles, with glide bombs, and Ukrainians have begun to make their own weapons, and they are making the drones in the millions and are sending them into Russia. Ukrainians are making those steps themselves. On the defense industrial base, the defense industrial side of this war, in 2014, when the Russians first invaded, we remember the Russians invaded in 2014 when they took Crimea. And then they invaded big time in 2022, 1,511 days ago. And at that time, the Ukrainians they manufactured, they used from their own companies, their own bases, 3% of the weapons that they used on the field. Today, it's 60%. Today, the Ukrainians are making more than half of the weapons that they use, and that dramatic increase is enabling them to take the place of many of the weapons that they were getting from the United States and others. So the Ukrainians are taking over this. There's also this question of negotiations. There are some negotiations that I will say that the Trump administration has sponsored in ways that the Biden administration didn't. Biden administration put a lot of effort and money into providing weapons to the Ukrainians so that they could hold off the Russians. But the Biden administration did not go into the diplomacy, into an attempt to negotiate an end to the war. The Trump administration, even though they have reduced to near zero the weapons and the financial support that the United States provides to Ukraine, they have, to their credit, stuck with the effort, up until Iran, stuck with the effort to negotiate an end to the war. Without success, but nonetheless, they've stuck with it. Many people thought that this administration, that President Trump would get frustrated or get discouraged or give up or throw up his hands and leave. He hasn't, which is something I think that we can come back to when we're talking about how this war could end. On the sea, by the way, the Ukrainians have no navy. The Ukrainians have no navy, and yet they have cleared the Russians out of the western part of the Black Sea using, again, drones. The drones that they manufacture. So this is, again, an area on the land where they're holding the Russians off, on the air where they're now matching the weapons and the strikes on Russia, and then on the sea where they've pushed the Russians out of that part of the Black Sea, enabling the Ukrainians to export. The negotiations recently led to a question about a ceasefire. President Zelensky has suggested many times a ceasefire would be in order, offered it to President Putin, sometimes in conjunction with President Trump. President Zelensky made an offer of a ceasefire, sometimes conditional, sometimes limited, and President Putin said no every time. In this last, on Easter, again, Zelensky proposed one a month ago. No response from President Putin until just before, and then he said, okay, we're going to have a 32-hour ceasefire. Zelensky said, fine, we'll do it if you do it, and then it broke down. The point here is, on negotiations, if there is a desire, if there is a will for there to be a ceasefire or to some kind of agreement on ending the war, it can be done. They've made some agreements. The Russians and Ukrainians have agreed to switch and exchange prisoners of war on a couple of occasions, on actually several occasions going on. So we know that can happen when it's in the interest, when the desire, when the intent is to have something happen, exchange these prisoners. But when the intent is to end the war, Putin says no. Putin has not engaged seriously on any of those kinds of negotiations to end the war, despite, again, President Trump sponsoring three-way conversations for the first time, Americans and Ukrainians and Russians. So this is the situation that we find ourselves now in Ukraine. I would like to just say a little bit about how I think this war could end. I don't know how it will, but how it could end. And then I love the most fun part of this conversation is when I hear your questions there. This war will end when President Putin realizes that he cannot win. When he realizes that there's no way that he's going to be able to accomplish what he set out to do. And again, we know what he set out to do, is to eliminate Ukraine, to absorb Ukraine into Russia. And when he realizes that he cannot do that, then he will have to come to the table and have the conversation. How's that going to happen? The only way that's going to happen is if there is pressure on Putin to stop this war. Right now, there's not pressure on him. Right now, he's not motivated. There's no intent. There's no reason for him to stop because he's not getting the pressure to stop. However, President Trump, the United States, has leverage on Russia. We've seen now the United States can use force. You described a lot of that force. And there's leverage that the United States has over Russia, that Trump has over Putin, that if he were to use it, he could force Putin to stop. He could convince Putin that he cannot win. The leverage that he's got is in a couple of forms. And we know that Putin knows this. We know that Putin understands that Trump's got the leverage on him. Trump last summer put sanctions on India for buying oil from Russia. Putin panicked. Putin knows that if that kind of pressure on purchases of Russian oil continues or expands, then his flow of funds into the treasury that's allowing his army to continue to fight against the Ukrainians, to aggress against the Ukrainians. He knows that that's in trouble. So he got on the phone, put down the phone to Trump and asked for a meeting, and they got a meeting in Alaska. It didn't end up in any kind of agreement, but it did show that Putin recognizes that the Americans have leverage over him economically. The same thing happened on weapons. Donald Trump was musing out loud, was talking out loud about the possibility of providing these Tomahawk weapons to the Ukrainians. And President Putin again panicked. Putin knows that if there's continued serious support, military support, for the Ukrainians from the Americans, then he's in trouble. He again gets on the phone and asks for a phone call with Trump, and he gets it, and he talks Trump out of providing those Tomahawks. So we know that Trump has leverage over Putin. So the question is how to put pressure on. He can do it. He can do it. When that happens, then what I would see is an end, a ceasefire, or at least a diminution of the fighting. Ukraine then can begin to work under a situation of peace, of some stability. If they're not being fired at, they can start up on regular political operations, political activities. They can start getting ready for an election in Ukraine. People have been talking about why there's not an election. Well, not an election in Ukraine, not an election in Ukraine because there's a war. And for all kinds of reasons, we can talk about that. But once Putin realizes he cannot win, and he goes for the ceasefire, then there can be elections, there can be movement towards the democratic kind of a system that the Ukrainians have been trying to put together for years. Speaking of which, the Ukrainians can then continue their path into Europe, into the European Union. This goal is achievable as well, not during the time of war, even though they've been working on how to take the steps to get into the EU. But that can happen. The Europeans have stepped up. Europeans have provided the kind of support to Ukraine that has kept them going. Even though the United States has reduced its support, Ukrainians have benefited from the Europeans who have stepped up. And that is, thank you. So there is, that's the direction. That's the direction on how this war can end. Pressure on Putin. Then Ukraine can become a normal European country in the EU. I would say in NATO, and well, it will take some time. But that's how this war can end. I was talking to someone who we had this conversation earlier about whether or not I was optimistic, and there is a way, there is a path that the Ukrainians can end this war with our support and with the European support. It's going to take some real action by Americans in order to put that pressure on, but that can be the direction that they go. All right, questions and kind of, I know there's going to be someone who will disagree with something that I've said here, but I would love to take the question. Who will?
So if you're in the back, if you don't mind coming forward, coming into this room so that we can hear you, and we'll answer your questions. Yes, please.
So you do see a pathway for Ukraine to join NATO?
I do. Not today. We haven't talked about security guarantees, which is going to be an important part of any solution, any end of the war. The best security guarantee would be membership in NATO. That almost happened. There was almost a decision back in 2008 to begin the process of Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. And the Americans were for it. George W. Bush, who appointed me to go out to Ukraine, was very much in favor of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, Biden administration and Trump administration is not in favor of that. But most of the Europeans are. I didn't mention that somebody raised this, but one big thing, another reason for optimism, is what happened in Hungary. So Hungary is one of the nations who now oppose Ukraine going into NATO. Hungary is also holding up $100 billion, 90 billion euros that the Europeans want to provide to Ukraine, and that's been held up by the Hungarians. Hungary also, just while we're on Hungary, has also been feeding information to the Russians and blocking any further sanctions on the Russians that the Europeans want to do. But they've also been able to put the stop on movement toward the EU and movement to NATO. That could change with the new Hungarian prime minister. So, short answer to your question about NATO is they certainly can at some point. It won't be now, but we've supported, the Americans have supported in the past, and we can come back around to that.
Yes, in the back, yes.
Do you have any guess as to how Putin convinced Trump to back down?
Do I have a guess about how Putin, how Trump can get Putin to back down?
No. How did Putin convince Trump to back down? And there's two examples.
Yeah. So he on the two examples. So Putin, when he saw that Trump had put sanctions on India, asked for a meeting, and they met in Anchorage. Putin came into that meeting expecting to be able to present this information, present his side of the story to Trump. Trump was not interested in that. Trump thought from Steve Witkoff, his envoy, that Putin was going to come in saying, look, I'm ready to compromise. And when Putin came in and did not talk about compromise, did go through a long history of all his grievances against Ukraine and Europe and the United States, Trump left. Trump cut that Anchorage meeting off without any kind of agreement, with barely a press conference. Took no questions on that because it was a failure. It was a failure of that. So that was how Putin tried to convince Trump and failed on that. On the tomahawks, that's a fair question. Trump was about to provide, thought seriously about providing tomahawks, and the Pentagon was ready to provide these. This would be very helpful to the Ukrainians. Not a game changer, but it would have been very helpful. And Witkoff suggested to Putin that Putin call Trump the day before Zelensky was going to be in the Oval Office on that Friday. And so they got the phone call on Thursday, and again, Putin convinced Trump not to provide those tomahawks. And if your question is, how did he do that? I don't know. It was not in that meeting, not on that phone call. But the two lessons I take from that are that Putin knows that Trump could put that pressure on.
Yes, please, Ellen.
Is Putin now that oil is so high from Iran more replenishing his coffers so he can go on this war?
So Ellen asked a very good question. The first part of what I was talking about was the effect of the Iran war on the Ukraine-Russia. And one of the big effects is increased oil prices. Putin and Russia sells oil in these shadow tankers, in these old rusty oil tankers and the Ukrainians are going after those tankers to try to reduce that. But you're exactly right. The increased oil price has increased the revenues. Putin has been able to replenish the treasury for a while. And the question is, what happens after that?
Yes, please.
So
So in my limited lifetime, knowing the experience between Israel and Palestine, is there any similarities or lessons learned now looking at Russia, the Ukraine situation? It just seems.
So the question is there parallels or lessons we learned from Israel, Palestine, and Russia and Ukraine. You will know, people in this room will know better than I, the complicated stories that the Israelis have and the Palestinians have. So I served in Jerusalem for a year, and had very good friends in all the communities. I would go down to Jericho with Palestinian friends and see their summer house. I would go to kibbutz with my Jewish friends and talk to their kids who were in the IDF. And, so we've all heard those stories on both sides, and it's complicated. That's a real complicated conflict. In contrast to, in my view, in contrast to the Russia-Ukraine, the Ukrainians did nothing to provoke that invasion. Either in 2014 when the Russians first invaded and took Crimea, or in 2022 when they invaded with 200,000 troops. The moral ambiguity associated in some sense with Israel-Palestine is not there with Russia. It's very clear who is the aggressor and who is the victim. And I don't see any of the rationale. Those are great questions.
Another question about parallels. You mentioned that Russia is the invading force, trying to, in a short matter of time, which has lasted much longer than they anticipated, take over Ukraine. But Ukraine is fighting for its culture, its destiny, its existence, if you will. Is there a parallel between how Iran feels towards the current invasion? That they're here to defend their culture and their civilization, and they'll play the long game. They'll be there for hundreds of years.
So I'm not an expert on the Iran thing, but it is very clear that that the Iranian regime doesn't represent the Iranian people. There's a real difference there. There's a real difference. This is not a democracy.
Right.
This is not a nation defending its values. This is a regime defending its regime. Whereas, as you say, Ukrainians are defending their form of government, of democracy. They're defending their land. They're defending their families. They're defending values that we share. So there is that.
Questions from the back of the house, if anybody wants to come forward and ask. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so more and more we're seeing Russia, and specifically Putin, put heavy stress on its sense of ethno-nationalism and uniting the common Russian people. Do you see, say, if this conflict is to end, do you see any of that going away in any sense of the word, or is that going to continue to be a driver of the regime to unite the USSR again, in a sense?
Yeah, no, I think Putin, as long as he's in power, Putin will, as he said he's trying to do, try to regather the lands. I mean, he's starting with Ukraine, but it won't end there. So I think that the threat of continued aggression after Ukraine will be there. And therefore, if we have a united Ukraine, or at least a Ukraine, again, I've got this map here to show that the Russians occupy 19% of Ukraine. That's the pink part here. But 81% of Ukraine is not under the control of Russians, and is told as Ukraine, it's real Ukraine. And if that prevails, then what needs to happen is to guard against exactly what you say, Putin trying to take more territory. We need to bolster our defenses. We go back to NATO. NATO is the deterrent it's keeping Russia from invading any NATO nation, and it's done that. It's succeeded in that, and the Soviets before it. But it's that kind of deterrence that's going to be necessary as long as Putin is there. Now, there is some possibility that the Russians, after they lose in Ukraine, will figure out that empire, exactly the process that you're talking about, the goals that you're talking about, of taking over more territory, or going after other parts of what used to be the Soviet Union, is a mistake. That empires, empires end. And if the Russians recognize that their empire is end, and they can just be a normal country, then that would be the end of it. But until then, we have to defend ourselves against that, either through NATO or through a much stronger Ukraine.
Yes, Don.
Yeah.
You have indicated that the pressure on Putin is coming externally, primarily from the assets the United States has and its influence. What about internally? Are the Russian people, do they recognize they've had 1 million casualties in Ukraine? And what are the prospects of any kind of internal pressures on Putin?
Question is there internal pressure on Putin in addition to the external pressures that we talked about? Is there any indication? You remember, and when the Russians and when the Soviets were fighting in Afghanistan, it was that kind of pressure from the bottom. It was from the mothers. It was the Russian and Soviet mothers that put pressure, and the Soviets finally left Afghanistan. The problem now is the oppression that the Kremlin exercises over the Russian people is so much heavier now than it was even in that part of the end of the Soviet Union. It's compared to what it was under Stalin. The level of pressure and oppression that the Kremlin can impose on Russian people is such that I don't see, smarter people than I am on Russian issues, internal Russian issues, don't see that rising up. We can all see, and people have pointed out, the economic problems, and that's what we were talking about in terms of cutting off the flow of funds to the Russians that they used to pursue the war. And they do have economic problems because they have funneled most of their resources into the military and the civilian side, which should, under what you said, should be evident to the Russian people that their lives are getting worse, in addition to the 1.2 million killed or wounded. But we don't see it in any kind of polling. We don't see it, no indication that Putin's worried about uprising. We just don't see it at that point. So I think we can't count on that, is what I'm saying. We can't count on that. What we can count on is what we control, and we control the support we give to Ukraine, and the outside pressures that we can put on the Russian economy.
Yes, please.
Hi, in the beginning you mentioned how news cycles will capture the global attention, like how it's went from Ukraine to Iran. There's currently active humanitarian crises in Africa. So how does the United States balance all of these and distribute resources across multiple crises across the globe?
It used to be, when many of us were in the government, that there was a process to allocate resources. We used to have an organization, maybe people in this room remember USAID, Agency for International Development, that whose business it was to help both on the development side and the humanitarian side around the world. That effort and those resources and that political process, internal policy development process, is no longer here. We don't have that in this administration. They're doing it differently, you know, and maybe it'll work out. But in answer to your question about allocating resources, it's driven by the president's view, and the lack of an interagency process to make those resource allocations has led to what you described.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
I have a question about the sort of leverage you were saying the U.S. has over Russia.
Yeah.
You were saying it's through military support of Ukraine and then sanctions on Russian oil and export. Do you think the sort of closing of the strait and a lot of U.S. weapons being shipped to Iran, right now,
Right.
do you think that has sort of weakened the U.S.'s leverage over Russia in any way?
I do. I absolutely do. I think the Iran, as I say, the Iran war has sucked resources and attention, but also has done exactly what you said. And what you said as well. I mean, Putin has been able to take advantage of increased flow of funds to continue his war. So I do think that the Iran, now that said, I think this Iran war will end sometime. And then I want to argue that when it does, when the Iraq war ends, then this administration, if it sticks to its commitment to end this war, President Trump keeps saying he's got one more war to end. You know, he's done all these 8 or 9 wars, he's got one more, it's the hardest one, he says. We can talk about all those other ones, but what we can say is he's stuck with it. And if he returns to the effort to end this war, he can do it for the reasons that you said, the leverage that you said.
All right, thank you.
There's one over here too.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes?
I'm curious, what was your reaction and analysis of Zelensky and Trump's exchange in the Oval Office?
So the exchange between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office last February, a year ago, February, was sickening. I mean, it was really sad. It was really sad. But that was the nadir. You know, that was the low point. In my view, it has been up since then. Not uniformly up, but jagged up. That is the relations between the United States and Ukraine, and frankly between Trump and Zelensky, has been up. And I give President Zelensky a lot of credit for managing that. The Ukrainians and the Europeans are doing, seem to me, 2 things along these lines, based on not just that meeting, but also other things that you mentioned, like Greenland and other. The Ukrainians and the Europeans are doing 2 things. One, they're trying to manage the relationship with the Americans. And I think Zelensky has done that. And I think other Europeans, Ruta, you know, the head of NATO, Secretary General of NATO, has been trying to do that as well. Because the United States does have leverage. The United States does have the ability to do these things. And the Europeans, you know, for now, need them. However, that exchange that you pointed out, as well as the Greenland debacle, suggests to the Europeans and Ukrainians that they can't count on the Americans forever. There better be a plan B. They better start planning for the time when the Americans are just not there. And they're doing that. And I mentioned that the Europeans are stepping up. Europeans are providing that $100 billion. The Europeans are raising their defense expenditures dramatically, in particular the Germans, but others as well. They are going to be able to defend themselves sooner or later, probably later, but they're starting to make these changes that allow them to defend themselves and to help Ukraine, starting based on that horrible meeting in the Oval Office.
We have about 10 more minutes. Yes, Joe, please, Joker.
I have 2-part question.
Oh.
Oh.
I'll write it down.
Thank you.
All right, here we go.
The first one goes back to our traditional allies. The whole NATO, everything you talked about. Is our breach irreparable? Is it something that can be overturned and we can reclaim those relationships? Or is it going to take some time past a presumed Trump era before we're able to have relationships that we've had in the past with our traditional allies?
We could certainly get allies back. We have to change the current attitude toward allies. I mean, the administration doesn't believe in allies like the previous administrations have. Republicans and Democrats have counted on not just NATO, but allies in, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. We don't put that in the NATO. And those relationships have been damaged for all the reasons that you raised in the beginning. They can be repaired. They certainly can be repaired. We have to earn it back. We have to learn again how to deal with allies. But it can be. The two tracks that I mentioned that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are doing, one, try to work with the Americans, and even while they're developing their own capabilities. One way to do that is to develop within NATO a European pillar, a European component of NATO, not to substitute for or be in place of NATO, no, but to make it clear that there is a European component, a pillar that can do this. The Europeans are doing this other work to develop their own capabilities, and the Brits and the French are putting together something called the Coalition of the Willing. And the Coalition of the Willing that the French and the Brits are leading, two nuclear powers, by the way. The Coalition of the Willing is making military plans to actually deploy forces into Ukraine once the fighting stops. And this is a European initiative. This is what's going to be needed in order to keep the Russians from violating the ceasefire or invading again. All to say that the Europeans are picking up the capabilities, and it is possible for us to re-establish the relationship. It'd be hard, and probably not. Yeah.
My second question is, looking at your map.
Yeah.
And the whole Russian advance, starting with Crimea, and seeing the blockage of access to the Black Sea, and for all of the marketing and all the need for access to the sea. Do you think that Russia is going to be able to retain sufficient control? You mentioned the fact that I thought you were saying through their drones that they were able to attack the Russian ships. But give us a little idea of what you see happening for the Ukrainian access to the sea for transport of
Right.
products.
So Joe asked about the ability of the Ukrainians to access the Black Sea, given the current situation where they have taken over Crimea, they've taken over Melitopol and Mariupol, that whole part of it. But the Ukrainians do have their largest port, Odessa. They do have their largest. Odessa is where most of their grain goes out. And it's exactly what you said, Joe. That is, the Russians did try to cut them off when the Russian Black Sea Fleet was able to operate in that part of the Black Sea. But the Ukrainians pushed them out. Using naval drones, subsurface drones and surface drones, and pushed them out. They took out and sunk well, it was the Black Sea Fleet, prime ship. It did, and so they have been able to open up those. Now, you bring up a good point. In these negotiations that are ongoing, that I don't put a whole lot of faith in, but nonetheless, the discussions going on between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Russians want the Ukrainians to give up part of their territory that the Russians don't control. Ukrainians' position is no, we'll stop on this line. We'll stop where we are. We stand where we stand, is what the Ukrainians have said. The Russians have been trying to take this little part of Donetsk, right in the middle there, little sliver. They've been trying to take that for 2 years. They've been trying to take it since 2014.
Right.
But intensely trying to take that little sliver for 2 years. Pokrovsk is the little town they've been trying to take, and they failed. And the Ukrainians have a very strong defense in that part of Ukraine, a very strong defense. And the Russians have not been able to take it, and they want the Ukrainians to give it up in negotiations, even though they're not been able to take it. This is to say that this is not a serious conversation on the Russian side.
Yeah, Damien in the back, come on forward. Damien is a graduate student in political science.
Damien.
So brace yourself.
All right.
It's gonna be brilliant.
I would just like to ask a clarifying question about, like, when you say Russia will lose in Ukraine, are you referring to their inability to effect regime change in Kyiv, or are you referring to, like, Ukraine being able to take back Luhansk and Donetsk?
Great question, Dave. All right. So what does winning and losing mean for Ukraine? Winning for Putin is clear. He wants to take over Ukraine. He will lose. I am absolutely convinced that he will never take all. He won't take that 81% that he doesn't now occupy. He may, for now, keep control of that 19% in red or pink. He may do that. But for Ukraine to win, they need to exist as a sovereign state. They can acknowledge de facto that the Russians occupy 19% of their country, and the Ukrainians will say that they'll get it back. Someday they'll get it back. The Ukrainians are willing to say, we're not going to try to take it back militarily. And this is similar to what happened after World War II when East Germany and West Germany. The West Germans never gave up hope that they would take back East Germany. But in order to get into NATO, the West Germans promised not to try to take back East Germany by force. And that got them into NATO, it got them into what became the European Union, the successful West Germany. Ukrainians remember that, and the Ukrainians say, that's the model. We won't take that back, we won't take that 19% back by force, but we'll, at 81%, that will get into the EU. That eventually into NATO, in my view, not in other people's view. That could be a successful country, a sovereign country, a democratic country, an independent country. That's success.
Dr. Chikoy, did you want to ask one of your student questions?
Yes, so I'm here, sorry. Ambassador Taylor, I teach human geography, and my students were doing a political geography session this week. And they're really interested in a couple of things, but since you were just talking about it, the land that's in pink on your map, you're suggesting that in a peace agreement, Ukraine would likely lose that territory. Okay, and then my second question is, to what extent in those areas are there people who are ethnically Russian that maybe are aligned with Russia, and what does that mean for like inter-ethnic conflict on the border region?
So in that part of Ukraine that the Russians now occupy, illegally occupy, 19%, there are mainly Russians who have moved in, Ukrainians who are either too old to move, or too poor to move, or disabled, unable to move for one reason or another. And so my bet is that this acknowledgement, this de facto acknowledgement by the Ukrainians that the Russians occupy part of their territory, can be the source of a compromise, of an agreement, and the Ukrainians have suggested as much. But I don't see the people, the Ukrainians who, you're right, there are still some Ukrainians in that 19%, in that occupied territory, but they've been there, for certainly 4 years, in some cases 12 years, since 2014, and they can probably continue to be there without the strife that you mentioned.
Last question.
Yes. I have two questions.
Okay.
I'll start with my first one. You mentioned that this war will end when Putin realizes that there's no way to win. However, have you taken into consideration variables such as other nations that support Russia and could provide economical support to combat American sanctions and their support?
So, the question about Russian allies is a very interesting one. There are only 2 nations in the world that will sell weapons to the Russians. And one of them's tied up right now, it's Iran. The other is North Korea. Now, you will say, rightly, what about the Chinese? The Chinese are not selling weapons to the Russians. They are selling dual-use equipment and chips and other things that the Russians use to manufacture themselves their weapons. But the Russians don't really have allies that are providing that kind of support. There are illicit movements of equipment and microchips and components through, not through allies, but through markets, black markets that are doing that. So in terms of the support that nations give to either Russia or Ukraine, Ukrainians have the support of all of Europe, of all of North America, of the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, and New Zealanders. That economic component dwarfs what the Russians don't have that kind of allies. Second question.
And just to follow up on that map,
Yeah.
you mentioned that Ukraine will lose some territory. Are you afraid that at some point it might become another Korea situation?
So it could. It could. It's a good question. So in Korea, the Korea solution is not a peace agreement. There's still no peace agreement, and that could be a situation that could obtain here as well. If then that 81%, the part in white here, goes on into the EU, eventually NATO, develops into a sovereign nation, that's success for Ukraine. And they will argue that at the end of Putin won't live forever, and maybe he's overthrown. Maybe there's some problems, but sooner or later, at some point, there won't be that kind of aggression from Russia. And at that point, the Ukrainians say we go to the East German solution that follows that on.
Perfect.
Thank you. Yep.
You've given us food for thought and a morsel of hope. I love the hopefulness in your tone. And please join me once again in thanking Ambassador Curris.